you don't know what Numbers 13 is about, that's after Moses, when he goes into Canaan to search out this holy promised land, and they find that it's already occupied. And those nasty Canaanites that Noah cursed, remember, were there, and among them were these very giant, fierce people who were of great size, and that they were too strong to attack them. That's why the later battle, they didn't want to fight them, because it was too bad. In 2 Samuel 21:18, there's another description of someone called Saph, who is one of the descendants of giants. And in Chronicles 28, it talks about the descendants of giants in Gath who fell by the hand of David. So it's all kind of in there, this idea of these giants, which is kind of strange. Now, archaeologist G.E. Wright states that the idea of the Nephilim as giants originated actually from Hebrews seeing the megalithic structures and cyclopean kind of masonry of the Canaanite cities, which would have been about 18 feet thick. And he notes that ancient Canaanites, from what they found, were actually relatively short before and after 3000 BC, with no significant findings of abnormality. So though physically it's possible and medically, there isn't actually proof of that yet, of them being there, no, archaeologically. But these people seem to be present throughout the early parts of the Bible and were of feared size. So maybe he was a giant. Going back to the idea of Goliath having this congenital pituitary gland disorder, the physician who wrote that stated that actually a small rock would have been perfect and knocked out such a fighter, because someone with that disorder, if they were hit in the head, it would have caused paralysis immediately. It would have fallen down. So that kind of takes the idea of how David would have been able to defeat him in such a way. And of course we know later David cuts off his head, so that actually would have been the cause of death there, if he would have been paralyzed momentarily. So, all that to say that, remember, this is supposed to be history, so there's some plausibility in it. That's how it could possibly happen. But it wasn't necessarily for us to moralize this into a lesson about a little guy conquering the big guy that we often see that it's used for. It's not really the story of an underdog about how we can be great champions of God even though we're small and little. So what is the story all about? Those are great lessons, by the way. But really, remember, this is to establish David's claim to the throne and Saul's loss of control. It is the beginning and the setup of Israel's kingship. So let's keep going. The history establishes David's claim. Saul has said that whoever killed Goliath could marry his daughter and be free from taxes. So it's often assumed that this is the main reason he would have become king. But remember, earlier in the story, he already made some pact with God. So why did he need that? Well, it shows that his kingship is beyond Saul. That David's story is a part of the covenant made with God even before. Where God says in Genesis 12:3 that he will bless those who bless you, and he will dishonor those, and those who dishonor you, he'll curse. So just like the Philistines were out there cursing God's name, well, David took care of that, because he's God's hand on earth to take care of those who curse you, sort of. Samuel's already anointed David to succeed Saul, and even before Saul made this agreement about marrying his daughter, he's already established his kingship. So it's kind of like a lore and propaganda, a little bit, about why he deserves to be this great king of Israel. David's story makes it so that anyone who would challenge his claim is lacking faith. In 1 Samuel 13, he's also described as a man after the Lord's own heart. And this later is reiterated even in Acts 13:22, where it says, after removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, and he will do everything I want him to do. Now, this puts David in a pretty powerful position. Of course, there's a bit more to the story between the slaying of Goliath and the taking over of the throne. But it's this section that really gives David this untouchable quality. In the realm of Christianity, David is often presented again as one of those biblical heroes. One of those founders of our faith, founders of the Jewish faith, who really can't do any wrong. I see your face, and we'll get to that. Yeah, you probably know, or some of you, that that's the true myth of this story. David did a lot of wrong. He was far from perfect. So what happens next is Saul gets extremely jealous when he sees that David will eventually be king, and tries to murder him several times. And even though David has a few chances to kill Saul, he doesn't, because Saul is still the anointed one up to that point. And so he spares him, being a good follower of God. But he still lies. He still manipulates a lot of people in these stories. And then later, when he actually becomes king, he gets to that whole Bathsheba stuff. So if you're not familiar with the story of Bathsheba, she was the wife of someone else who was bathing one day, and he watched her bathe, and then he decided that she was so beautiful he must have her. So he sent her husband to war so that he would get killed on the battlefield, and he essentially rapes her in the story. Not what I would think is a man after God's own heart. That's kind of hard to. And then later, his own son does something similar. It says, now David admitted that he had done wrong to God. He did actually come clean about it a little bit. But later his son, Amnon, rapes his half-sister. And David knows about it. And he knows that it's wrong, but he decides not to punish his son and lets him go. And this creates such a problem between his two sons that they end up splitting up the kingdom sort of over it and going to battle. So he's not exactly this great early leader, this example of heroes that's untouchable, that we should really emulate, right? So this is a great example of hero worship. Similar to Jonah and Noah, we often tell these kids' versions that perpetuate this false narrative of this holy sainthood, all these biblical figures who did these amazing miracles, and they must have been awesome, so awesome that these things don't happen anymore because, there aren't people as cool as that anymore. But even with that, we know those people disobeyed God. We know they committed horrible sins. So what's the problem? What's the problem with this? Is there a problem? What do we think?
We need to rewrite children's stories.
A little bit. I mean, it's hard to do that. What's the example I was listening to that talked about, there's the milk of Scripture, the stuff you start babies on, but you need to get to the meat of the Scripture. As you're an adult, you can start them with the milk, but if you keep them on milk through their whole life, they're going to be very malnourished if that's all they get. You need the nutrients later on as you build and you grow. So you need to start adding that stuff in, and you can't forget to go back and revisit these scriptures. Read the Bible daily. No. Me either. It's been a while. I used to. How many of us have read any of these chapters within the past 5 years? No.
I think one of the things for me is, like you tell the story of David, it's very disconnected.
Mhm.
Like this morning when you mentioned David killing Goliath and then David being a king, I thought, oh, that's right. But that doesn't, when you talk about the story of David and Goliath, I don't think of David as a king.
Right. Because we take the Bible in these tiny little chunks and we never remember to put the history of it together. Or to actually sit down and look at what the meaning of it is. We do that in history too. I used to do that all the time. Like in school, you're taught certain events, and I'm like, I could never keep track of when things happened because I'm like, they didn't teach that this was going on at the same time that was going on. And oh my gosh, that's all the same timeline. Like the Revolutionary War, and this was going on over in this part of Europe at the same time. So I'm terrible at history because of that. And I think we're all terrible sort of at biblical stuff too because of this. So I'm not saying that we need to necessarily always focus on the bad parts of the story, right? We just need to connect them. Because if we overlook them and pretend that they never existed, that God never chooses someone who would do those horrible things, then we get into this really dangerous sort of territory. We forget that God chooses normal, fallible people all the time. And we think that he only chooses those who can do no wrong. And we still do this. Maybe a little less recently with some of the Me Too movements and things, but the same mentality really creeps into our society in a lot of ways. You get priests and ministers. They could never hurt anyone. They're a man of God. I'm going to trust my child alone with them no matter what. No. No, they are human, and there are bad things that have happened because of that trust of forgetting that they're human and thinking that they're just this emblem of God on earth. Or what about things like there's that actor or those athletes, they are these great heroes of our culture. But we let them get away with a lot. A lot of abuse, rape, drugs, lots of things. Yet somehow we still idolize them.
But they're not all like that.
They're not all like that. No, they're not. But some are. And we let them get by as long as they get that score at the end of the game.
Cleveland Browns are worried about that.
Yeah. It's a slippery slope when we start to teach our kids that these Bible figures are perfect and that they didn't do anything wrong, because then you start to justify, well, he didn't, the husband was dead before David got to Bathsheba, right? Because he went to war. We forget that, David sent him there. And that maybe he might have done some things beforehand and that this was just to cover it up. We start to make little bits of excuses. Yeah.
Didn't that child die that was conceived?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then
And Nathan confronted him. It wasn't like he just confessed.
Yeah.
when is it that Nathan that comes and faces David with his story?
Yeah.
So that sooner or later, we all have
Things come out. Now, David does actually repent several times. Whenever he does something wrong, he either gets confronted or he kind of, either by God or by someone else, and he's like, yes, I did this terrible thing, God, and I'm really, really sorry. Please help me to do better next time. And then they kind of come back together, and he's back on track, and he does these great things for God again until he messes up again. It's over and over again. He kind of does this.
And that is the good thing, I believe. God likes it that way. If you do the wrong thing and you realize that you do the wrong thing, then you confess. That's better than doing the wrong thing. Then you still don't believe that you have done the wrong thing.
Exactly.
that one is so bad. You know that you are wrong, so you still believe that you are doing the right thing.
Yeah, that's the key part of the story, is you can't just kind of wash over it and pretend like nothing happened. There has to be that element of humility, of forgiveness, of recognition that you're fallible, that they're fallible, and that the good comes from God, not from that person necessarily. I remember several years ago when I used to direct a youth camp, I heard this really great sermon about how we can all be saints, right? About how God calls us all to join in the communion of saints, and we are all called to do these great things on behalf of God. We're all meant to search, to do the different spiritual gifts, right? All of these things. That's a part more of Presbyterian teaching than some things, than some places. But so my co-director was a Catholic. Poses a huge problem. We got into a giant fight about it, like huge fight. We stopped working together partially over this, that how dare I compare regular people to the saints? How dare I? And I was like, well, I love St. Francis of Assisi. He was one of my favorites growing up as a kid. Confirmed sinner, known for partying and drinking. Bit of a womanizer before he changed his ways. Paul, killer of Christians. Killed a lot of them. St. Olga of Kiev killed her husband. St. Augustine was a thief who had a child out of wedlock and led a very immoral life. So the idea of sinless, perfect people that we like to try and say exist is totally wrong. God uses those terrible, horrible people when they turn to Him and ask for forgiveness and have humility. So why do we do it? Why do we create these heroes, these perfect beings? Why do you think we do it? I think part of it comes from this tricky line about David being a man after God's own heart. That's hard. If that's true, and David wasn't a great guy, what does that say about God? God condones rape and lying and all this nasty stuff in the early parts of the Bible. Is God a liar? Is He unjust? Doesn't kind of go with this good and godly line that Jesus is supposed to come from out of the line of David. So we make up a lot of excuses. We have to remember that we don't have to throw it all out for the sake of the bad. God doesn't work that way. It's more a case of hate sin, not the sinner. We always have this whole story of not just the good and the bad. We have to look at the whole person. We're all capable of really terrible mistakes and really evil things. Scripture tells us that we all fall short of the glory of God, yet we're all immensely capable of good, great works of good. David definitely did bad things, but he also allowed himself to be used by God for God's sake. And he begged for forgiveness and asked to be made better. I think that if you look at the past of historical figures, you can kind of see this trend. You can either see that there's this push and pull, maybe like Noah or like Jonah, where the person is fallible, they make mistakes, but they do these great good things that somehow outweigh those mistakes. At least they came back and did what God asked. And you see others who are kind of all evil, right? Every human, even the most evil human, has some characteristics that are good. No one is entirely bad. You've got murderers who get away with it for years because they were the neighborhood friendly guy that played with every little kid, went to church on Sunday, and no one suspected them of any of it because generally they were a good person. You know?
Actually, in Cleveland, we've experienced this, I guess it's been 10 years now. Everybody remember the neighborhood wonderful elderly gentleman, Demyanyuk, who's sitting around here, everybody talked about what an upstanding citizen, everything he was. He was tried in Germany for horrendous crimes at the concentration camps, which they had abundant evidence on him, and there was such an outpouring of defense. Because of his age, going so many years without being caught, should mean you should get away from justice, or just people talking about his character and everything, but really didn't know who he was before he came over. So we've experienced this locally, where somebody who had his hand in the responsibility of thousands of deaths, and people are always, we think we know them, but there's always that excuse.
Yeah. So we like to put people in these packages. They're either all good or they're all bad. That's not really how things work. We forget there are levels. And that the scale of good and bad is a daily choice. That God is all forgiving and things can be turned around, but at the same time, that you can't just look at the surface level and think everyone is good, because they might have some secrets. So how can it be that David is so much like God if he's so fallible? How can any of us be like God if we're so fallible? So it says in Genesis, we're all made in his image.
We all sin and fall short. It says that too, I think.
Mm-hmm. Part of it, I think, I like the idea of humanity being made in God's image, not as a physical, but as this idea that we are like God because we all have this choice that God has. We have this choice to do good, to do evil, to follow him, or not to follow him. And I think David had that choice too. I think that God, in the early parts of the Bible, actually throughout the whole Bible, all the stories point to this idea of him wanting a relationship with us, right? And I think we all have sort of this innate desire for relationship too, whether it's to God or to others. We have this need for connection. And these early stories of Noah, of Jonah, of David, they show that humanity messes up, but God is still there for the connection with us.
Don't forget that God gave us free will.
Right, that's what I mean. We have
That
choice.
was his decision and maybe his downfall.
Oh,
Maybe.
I mean, if you want to go that far with your thought, giving us free will, I mean, we don't always do what he
Right.
thinks is best for us. But he waits.
Yeah, I mean, and you could make that argument, I guess, that maybe God made a mistake by giving us free will. But then at the same time, how can you ever have a relationship and show love if it's forced? You can't. It has to come from your own personal choice. It has to come from you realizing, oh crap, I made a mistake. God, please help me to do better the next time. So the problem here is we create these biblical figures, these saints, these perfect images, and we forget that they're humans, just like us. That they failed, we fail, but God still loves us, still wants to be a part of that relationship. And we forget that, we read these stories and we hear God spoke to Noah, God told Jonah this, God, was in communication with David, and he still used them. But that's a myth. That's a myth. There weren't really floods. No one could be swallowed by a fish. giants are crazy, what are these ideas? These are myths, you're biblical heroes, right? That's not me. I don't have to think that God's going to speak to me. I'm not perfect like Jonah, Noah, and David. You see where that becomes a problem? If I start to think that all of these, disciples in the Bible or all of the early biblical figures, if they're these perfect, great biblical heroes who did miracles and spoke to God, but that's a myth, then I don't have to think that God speaks to me. And I don't have to think that I need to be in a relationship with him, that he craves that relationship with me, that I have a choice every day to do something good or to do something bad, and that everyone who does these horrible bad things also have that same choice, and that we're all a little bit more complicated than maybe we like to make it out to be. And that becomes dangerous when we start to make that. We start putting up these barriers. We start letting people get away with different things and start thinking that you aren't a part of that life that God calls us to. Have you ever heard someone say that if they walked into a church, it'd probably fall down on them? Mm-hmm. Used to be pretty common. I used to hear that a lot. That's crazy. Church is full of sinners. It's led by some of the worst of them. That's not the point. The point is that God, the perfection comes from God. It turns us around. That we choose to come here and be here and listen and learn and be in communication, even if throughout the whole week we've messed up. Because that's what it's about. It's about remembering that we mess up, and it's okay. And if you ever have someone who tries to tell you that they haven't,
Right.
run. Run. There are lots of people who like to pretend that they could do no wrong. So, the story of David, it sets up this idea of kingship. This idea of Israel's first connections with God, the blessing that he gives us. But it doesn't really end with that. We're a part of that history. So stop thinking that you aren't capable of slaying giants, of injustice, or other things. And don't for a second fall for those claims of perfection from those who say they've never sinned, because that's the myth. And that's what gets you in trouble. And start remembering, to make that choice between good and bad, and to look at everybody else's choices too, and really see them.
I just don't thought this. We have to define good and bad. I mean,
We today,
every day, all of us have to define good and bad. I mean, something may be bad in our perspective or our mind, but not in somebody else's.
Oh, completely. And I mean, that's true within the Bible too. I mean, I was talking with the youth the other day. We were going over another one of the Old Testament stories, and it came up this story of Jezebel, right? This horrible, the worst woman in the Bible, in the world, who killed thousands and thousands of God's saints. Okay, but there's also this scholarship kind of that's coming out now saying a lot of that's probably some propagandized writing because she was the enemy. She was from the other side's camp, and she was a woman, and all of these other things. So, was it? History is written from the side of the winner. So, yeah, I mean, good and bad can be seen differently. Both sides of the army or of the wars generally think they're on the right side. No one thinks they're a bad guy. So then it becomes problem, how do you define good? And are you capable of defining good? Because if we're both capable of being on the side of what we think is right, and we're battling each other, which one of us is right? Are we just right because we won? There has to be something beyond that, and I think what that is God. So if you come to the point of God's message, it's that we're to love one another, that we're to connect with one another, that we're to be in relationship with Him. And if it goes beyond that, we're on the wrong side. And that's not good.
I don't read the Bible, but I have devotions, and then there's little portions. We read part of it. And as I've said before, I'm not a scholar. I grew up without a Bible and all that. But recently, maybe it was even this week, this portion of the devotion, it talked about Moses, putting back, and whoever it was that took over for him, I'm blank now. Who
Aaron.
took over for Moses? Aaron. Anyway, he went into a land. He was ordered to go into the land and destroy and take over everything that was there. Now, isn't that sounding familiar?
Yeah, that's actually part of the story that I was talking about, where the Nephilims lived. It was the land of Canaan. This first land.
I mean, they just took over.
Yeah.
I mean,
But it all comes from this tradition of all of that. But why was that written? It's because they were the other guys. So you have to kind of pull apart in the Bible what is coming from humanity and what the message is. And the message is not to go into each town and murder them. The message was that these rulers made a ton of mistakes, but God still kept trying to connect with them and still kept giving forgiveness. Yeah. Thank you. Next week we'll talk about Ruth. Change it up, do a little bit about